AskReddit by S.W. Murray. What are the strangest stories you've heard from your grandparents? My granddad only had one ear. When I was little, he told me that he'd been eavesdropping at a door when he was young, and the door got slammed on it. He told that's why it was important to never try to eavesdrop on others, because bad things could happen. I was horrified. I learned much later that he'd had it amputated due to skin cancer. I had an old guy with a similar trick. He was my granddad's best friend, and was missing the top segment of his pointer finger on his left hand. He lost it in a work accident in the 70s, but told all the kids that it died and fell off cause he picked his nose too much. Story for few but a reality I've witnessed. This is a story from India during mid-1920s. My great-grandfather, after the death of his wife, married again for the sake of his daughter. The girl he married was 11 years old when he was in his 40s. So he basically married a girl who was younger than his own daughter. This second wife of his would go on to be my great-grandmother, and she lived with us briefly during my childhood, so everyone knew her history, her story, and the favorite question directed at her was, how the heck would you marry someone 40 plus when you were 11? To which she'd say, at 11, I didn't even know what marriage meant. I was just a little girl playing on the streets until I wasn't. That is something you expect from 1,000 years ago, not recently. How sad. My grandfather was in the same hospital wardroom when General Patton slapped a soldier. The soldier was in the throes of a violent PTSD episode and was physically fighting a nurse. When Patton slapped the soldier, it snapped him out of the flashbacks that he was having and brought him to his senses. The soldier later apologized to the nurse he was fighting and thanked Patton for helping him. Was what Patton did the best way to handle someone in that soldier situation? Probably not, but it was all he could think to do to stop the nurse from getting hurt. Honestly, given what they knew about PTSD back then and who was actually there to help, that was probably one of the better things. About 100 years ago, in Eastern Europe, a man was watching his baby niece while the parents attended a wedding. The parents returned to an empty house. The man had given the baby to the local mafia boss in lieu of paying off his gambling debts. When the parents figured out what happened, they went to the police, but none of the local authorities would lift a finger to help them. They basically had to live in that town, watching their daughter grow up from afar. It was heartbreaking. She ended up marrying the mafia boss's nephew and living a very comfortable life. What the fuck? I would have skinned that uncle alive if I were those parents. WWII. My grandfather lied. He wanted to work in the war as an electrician. Red wires, green wires, yellow wires, blue. You know, all the important colors, except that grandpa was colorblind. He lied about it and would trace wires all the way back to the beginning. After the war, he opened his own electrical shop serving the small city he lived in BC, Canada. Same for my grandfather, also colorblind, but he wanted to be a pilot. No dice, mate. But he could be an aircraft mechanic, and those planes needed regular maintenance flights, so he was happy. When my grandmother was dying, my mom and aunts were going through pictures with her, trying to get accurate dates and identities of people in the photos. Grandma stayed very cognizant until the very end. There were several pictures of her and her many siblings being held by two women no one recognized, and Grandma said, oh, those were our governors. And went on to tell how our family was rich, like aristocratic rich, and owned a large fancy hotel in San Francisco where my great-grandfather ran the family business from. This was also during the time when people didn't trust banks, so the several $million fortune we had was held in cash in that hotel, which burned down, and we went from rich to poor real quick. Edit grammar. Wow, that's wild. Not sure it's strange, but I remember my grandfather telling us about his childhood and about the day the family home first got electricity. They just had one light wired up in the living room, but he said it was like magic. Flipping a switch and there was light. No more lighting lamps or trimming wicks. Just bright light whenever you wanted it. We've come a long way. Along the same line as not strange, but interesting, at least to me. The story my great-grandfather told of he and his friends skipping school and running all day to the nearest major road to see the first Ford cars rolling through the state. It was their first time seeing a car in person. There was a story about a rogue monkey swinging around the bayous of Louisiana, and sometimes it would throw snakes down at boats. When it was told, my grandma laughed harder than I've ever seen her. There are monkeys in Florida, mostly in the Silver Springs area. They were originally brought here for tourism and research purposes in the 30s and 40s and escaped or were deliberately released into the wild, and the environment is pretty good for them here, so they've survived and reproduced. Stay away from them if you ever see them. They bite and they have herpes. My grandfather was one of the earliest people to receive penicillin. His GP freaked out when he had a handwritten note from Alexander Fleming. Any chance you still have the note? I have the story of Aunt Judith, which was told at every family gathering. Aunt Judith was my paternal grandfather's aunt, and a very tall, extremely curvy woman. She never married. Most thought it was because men found her intimidating. I personally think she might have been gay or ace, but either way she lived alone her entire life. She was an extra grandma to my dad and his 5 siblings, and when she died, the entire family helped to tidy up and clean her apartment. And they found ginormous hip and breast pads. Aunt Judith was not, in fact, an extremely curvy woman. In fact, she was stick thin, and apparently not happy with it. No one had ever seen her without the pads. No one suspected a thing. It kind of became a family legend, because they were all just so flabbergasted by it. So yeah, basically my Aunt Judith was a fab drag queen full time. Fuck yeah, Judith. My grandfather told me that when he was a kid, he used to string popcorn and then get the chickens to eat it. Then he would lead them around the yard by pulling the string like a leash. Used to freak me out when I thought about it. My great-granddad was a firefighter in WW2. He walked along the top of factories with a stick, knocking off unexploded bombs. Somehow he survived and was given a little trophy as a thank you, which my parents still have. My maternal grandmother, Gert, told the story about how she once left her purse on the sill of an open second-floor window which faced a very tight alley. This was in South Philly during the 1940s. She swore that Wilt Chamberlain stole her purse by climbing up to her window. I found it hard to believe. Why am I laughing so hard at this? This is something my mom found out when she went to a relative's funeral in another state, long after both her parents died. My grandma got her sister to write a letter, or sign a document, saying I'm her mother and I give her permission to get married, I assume because they were too young. Then she rode a train to the factory my grandpa worked at, and they took the train to another state and got married. They came back and hid the fact that they were married because they worried that one of their dads would murder grandpa. But the relative didn't know anything about how or when they told their parents. I knew a woman from Germany who got her brother to forge a letter giving her permission to get married before she became of legal age. She was in her 80s when I knew her. My grandfather in high school told me a story about how he and his friends saw a police car with the door open on the side of the street, so they ran into it and knocked the door off. They then circled the block, picked up the door and threw it in the back of their truck. On the next day they brought it to school to brag about it, and the teachers found out and told the police, and all they got was a warning. He also told me that teachers would hit them hard on their arm with a belt if they were acting up in any way. So he would rub onion on his arm and purposely get in trouble, so when he got hit it would go very red, then show his parents and they would go bitch out the teacher, and it never happened again. Was his onion tied to his belt? That was the style at the time. When my grandfather was a kid in the Netherlands, late 1920s, he was skating on a canal and went through the ice. His dog, A German shepherd that was following him along the bank of the canal ran over and dragged him out. Apparently the town mayor gave the dog an award. Grandma sent my 80-year uncle with a coat for my grandpa while he plowed the fields. He finished up, never seeing his son. My uncle had covered up with the coat and slept under a tree that night. They didn't know he was gone till he walked in for breakfast. Uncle confirmed the story. I was so nervous the first half of that story. My grandfather was on Jeopardy. He didn't win, but it was an incredible experience for him. My aunt was on once when Art Fleming was still hosting. She won a few $100s and kept a framed copy of the check on the wall for the rest of her life. My great-grandma built Spitfires, then was a welder repairing large ships on T-Sport. I remember watching Flashdance with her as a kid, and in the intro while she's welding going, "Look at the color of that burn. The mix is all bloody wrong. What's she trying to keep together? Peanut brittle." She then gave me her recipe for peanut brittle. So wholesome, I love it. Wife's grandma was in their house when lightning struck very closely. Ball lightning appeared in the kitchen, where she was. She described it as floating, bouncing along the floor. No reason to not believe her. I recently saw ball lightning in Berlin. It was this March, during a huge thunderstorm. We had just managed to get on a bus before it started absolutely pissing down, lightning everywhere, and we had to ride for nearly the entire line, because no way in hell were we changing over with that weather, so no URS barn. And then, over some houses, I just suddenly saw a ball of pale light, moving really fast in a zigzagging line, and while I was still questioning my eyesight and sanity, it already vanished. I just looked at my friends and was like, "Guys, I think I saw ball lightning," and they absolutely didn't give a single fuck while I was in awe. It was really cool. Also just fast as fuck. My grandmother had a child after my mom that she gave up for adoption. The father was my grandfather's brother. That child found me on Facebook 15 years ago, telling me she was my mother's sister. My mother had tried to look for her before the internet, so when she found me, I was happy to connect my mom and her long-lost sister. After immigrating, I only saw my grandfather once and my grandmother twice. Mainly because of the US's 64-year embargo on Cuba. The only thing I remember my grandfather saying to me is, "Soy un gangster," because he was wearing a fedora. My grandmother took me to Disneyland. When my cousins and I were all really little, our nana told us that if we planted kisses on Granddaddy's bald spot whenever we walked behind his chair, that his hair would grow back. It became such a habit that, to this day as a 35-year-old woman, whenever I visit them and I walk past Granddaddy sitting in his favorite chair, I have to kiss his head. My grandfather did competitive unicycling, like on an international level, and was apparently pretty good. What's strange is that I've never seen a unicycle at his place, any trophies, or even heard my grandparents talk about it. He's not even into watching or playing other sports. Only found out when my great aunt mentioned it in passing and I was like, what? When my grandmother was a teenager, she and her family lived in a small town near the Ontario-Quebec border that was very rural, as in their backyard was basically the woods. She told me that when she, as the oldest, and her mother would go outside to hang or bring in the laundry, they had to tie her younger sister to a tree in the yard, because they were afraid she'd run off into the woods and become their lunch. She also remembered a day when her dad came home drunk and her mom chased him away from the house with an axe.